Let me first acknowledge the excellent work done by our partners in today's event, the Canadian Centre for Energy Information, the Canadian Embassy, the Canadian Electricity Association, and Global Public Affairs in Calgary. Let me also thank KeySpan Energy and Powerex Corporation for their support, as well as the generous support of Hydro-Québec for this morning's breakfast. I would like to welcome each of our panelists to the Woodrow Wilson Center, as well as you, who have come to listen and to discuss the issues surrounding electricity in the Canada-U.S. context. In a few moments, I will turn the floor over to Colleen Killingsworth, President of the Canadian Centre for Energy Information, and to Hans Konow, President of the Canadian Electricity Association, who will chair the first part of this morning's program. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Centre, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars is the living national memorial to the 28th President of the United States, established by the United States Congress in 1968 within the Smithsonian Institution. It is a nonpartisan institution supported by public and private funds engaged in the study of national and world affairs. The Center establishes and maintains a neutral forum for free, open, and informed dialogue. It does not have a research or legislative agenda. As a distinguished scholar and the only American president with a PhD, Wilson felt strongly that the scholar and the policymaker were engaged in a common enterprise. The Wilson Center's Canada Institute looks at the key issues in the United States-Canada relationship. Our aim is to advance the dialogue between our countries by increasing public understanding, encouraging discussion across different sectors, and working towards pragmatic solutions. This is the fifth in our series of Woodrow Wilson Center cross-border forums on energy issues. We have been exceedingly pleased with the positive interest and response that we have gotten to these forums, and I'm happy to say that they have become a regular part of the Center's programming here. As you know, energy has an important impact on people in so many ways. It empowers our economies and our daily lives, and enables our productivity and our lifestyle. Here in North America, reliability of the supply and delivery of electricity, concerns over regulation of and investment in the industry have come to the forefront. The dynamic and prosperous energy relationship between Canada and the United States includes not only petroleum-based products, but a lively trade in electricity going both ways. Within this extensive relationship, though, there are inevitable policy, regulatory, and environmental challenges. To address those challenges, we need a candid dialogue across the U.S.-Canadian public and private sectors. We need to assess the current state of North American investment in the electricity system, the potential for future development and cooperation, and the obstacles and challenges that will, no doubt, appear on the horizon. The Canada-United States relationship works best when Americans and Canadians communicate regularly and act together on behalf of our many shared interests. Forums like this provide an opportunity for the kind of partnership, dialogue, and practical cooperation that has enabled our people to forge what is the most successful bilateral relationship ever enjoyed by neighboring states. Earlier this month, the Canada Institute hosted a similar high-level forum on softwood lumber in Vancouver, and a public conversation in Toronto on border issues between former Secretary of Homeland Security Tom Ridge and former Deputy Prime Minister John Manley. It is now my pleasure to leave you in the hands of people who are much better qualified than me to speak to you about the important topic of the day. First, Colleen Killingsworth.
Thank you, David. Good morning, and welcome to this morning's forum. My name is Colleen Killingsworth, and I'm the president of the Canadian Centre for Energy Information. On behalf of the Centre for Energy, I have the pleasure of welcoming you to this fifth forum on cross-border energy issues. It's been our pleasure to collaborate with the Canada Institute of the Woodrow Wilson Center in developing and hosting the series of cross-border forums on energy issues. Like the Canada Institute of the Woodrow Wilson Center, the Canadian Centre for Energy Information supports a collaborative learning and outreach approach on energy-related issues among North American audiences. We believe that a well-informed and educated public better understands and supports policy decisions, makes better business decisions based on energy, invests in energy, chooses careers in energy, and even uses energy more wisely. For those of you who are not familiar with the Canadian Centre for Energy Information, we are a nonprofit organization created in 2002 to meet an urgent need for information about all aspects of the Canadian energy system, from energy sources such as oil, natural gas, and coal, to thermal and hydroelectric power, nuclear, solar, and wind energy, as well as energy conservation and efficiency. Our mandate is to build an awareness and understanding of the Canadian energy sector and energy-related issues among North American audiences, promote and stimulate an inquiry and informed, objective, enlightened discussion and debate regarding the Canadian energy sector and energy-related issues, provide Canadian schools and teachers with outreach programs and energy-related curriculum-linked educational materials for students from kindergarten to grade 12. Developed for North American audiences, the Centre for Energy provides easy access to complete and comprehensive and credible information on Canadian energy. Through our print publications and web portal, the Centre for Energy delivers accurate, factual, and current information on Canadian energy. As a president of an organization established to promote informed discussion and debate, I applaud the Woodrow Wilson Forums for their achievement in building and creating constructive dialogue and understanding that is critical to the success of our integrated North American energy markets. I'm confident that today's forum will be no different given the caliber of panelists and participants. I would like to personally thank our partners, David Biette and his team here at the Canada Institute of the Wilson Centre, Paul Connors and the Canadian Embassy and his team there, Hans Konow and his team at the Canadian Electricity Association, and Lorraine Royer and her team at Global Public Affairs. And most importantly, our sponsors for this event, Powerex, KeySpan, and Hydro-Québec. Without your help and support, today's forum would not have been possible. It is now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Hans Konow, President and CEO of the Canadian Electricity Association, who will provide an overview of our cross-border electricity market. Thank you for making time today and enjoy the forum.
Thank you very much, Colleen, and welcome everybody. This is going to be a dialogue, although you'll have to put up, I'm afraid, with a distinguished panel who will make some opening remarks and hopefully set the scene for a conversation which will then go behind closed doors to allow everyone to be frank. Your comments at that point will not be recorded. However, what we're hoping for is an absolutely gloves-off discussion and debate around some of the issues that confront our industry. And I certainly, for one, feel that this industry is at a bit of a turning point, both in terms of opportunities, but also in terms of some of the challenges we face. So what I thought I would do is just spend 5 or 10 minutes giving you a little bit of an overview from the Canadian side before I introduce the panel, and each of them will have roughly 10 minutes to make their remarks, and at the conclusion of all of the remarks we'll have a 15-minute break. You can marshal your thoughts and questions, and then we will get back and engage. So let me begin by adding my thanks to the Woodrow Wilson Center and to Colleen and the Center for Energy. We think this kind of conversation is important. We have been working for some time to create a similar type of conversation within Canada involving all of the energy interests, because when we look at electricity, we look at it as part of an integrated energy system, and you can't really take all the pieces apart without and do justice to the challenges facing us. For the last 8 years or so, CEA has made an annual visit to Washington. That's testimony to the importance we place on the relationship between Canada and the U.S. with respect to electricity. We see it as an opportunity to enter into a whole discussion about the North American electric system, a system that interconnects Canadian and U.S. electricity markets and is one of the most integrated and reliable systems in the world. Both countries derive enormous benefits from this integration. We talk about this every time we come to Washington, and the message, in our view, is an important one. But an equally important message, and one that is becoming more pressing by the day, is that maintaining the opportunity, maintaining the benefits, will require facing up to the challenge of new builds. That challenge is particularly pressing at this time in Canada, where several provinces are looking at significant supply constraints. the likes of which we've not seen in the past, and which are changing the historic dynamic of northern Canadian supply feeding U.S. markets to the south. And I'll come back to that when I talk a bit about the trade statistics. To meet those challenges and to ensure the future adequacy of electric infrastructure and supply, we must work cooperatively. Specifically, we need to promote cooperation in enhancing electricity supply, enhancing transmission infrastructure, and addressing pressing environmental issues such as air quality and climate change. And we also have to share the best practices that we develop on energy efficiency. So in conjunction with today's forum, the Canadian Electricity Association has just released our annual North American paper, and this year it's entitled Investment in Electricity Infrastructure and Supply, a North American Concern. You have copies of the brown-colored copies in your binder, and I will refer to a couple of the charts in there. So each year we include some graphics in the paper to give the reader a more visual feel for the relationship. And let me take a moment to review a few of those with you on pages 3 and 4 respectively. You'll find maps of the North American transmission grid and major transmission interconnections. These two pictures give an excellent snapshot of how much integration there is coast to coast between our two countries in the electricity marketplace. A closer look at the realities that lie behind these maps would also tell the reader that this integrated system hasn't changed very much over the last few decades. Most of our major transmission corridors have not seen sufficient investment in the last 20 years to meet the growing demand of the market for more electricity, and this has contributed to serious congestion problems. Also on page 4, the reader can see the generation breakdown in our two countries. The contrast in generation portfolios is evident, with thermal generation forming the bulk of capacity in the U.S. and hydro the principal source in Canada. This diversity of primary fuel sources encourages market integration, as it argues for efficient power flows north or south at various times depending on market circumstances. Cross-border trade means Canadian and U.S. generators can better optimize the economics of their respective portfolios. But the generation portfolio profiles also speak to a major challenge. As demand increases and older facilities are in need of upgrade or replacement, the need to site and build more generation capacity grows increasingly urgent. Whether it's conventional fossil, nuclear, hydro, or emerging technologies like wind, biomass, or solar, all will be needed. And as we reflect on our investment requirements, it's important to remember the context in which the public views them. Consumers across North America expect their electricity supply to be reliable, environmentally sustainable, and affordable. Addressing reliability means avoiding blackouts, because we all know the costs and hazards that they represent. Addressing environmental sustainability means ensuring we meet all of our obligations and commitments, but also that we drive forward with efforts to constantly improve our environmental performance. Addressing affordability means helping the consumer to better manage his or her own consumption, factoring in opportunities for demand-side management and energy efficiency. Addressing all of these demands is a challenge, and part of our discussion on investment, because of the public understands the need for more investment, they need to understand what is at stake in producing and delivering electricity to them. That education task is at times the most critical one if we are to solicit public support for our efforts to address what is a public need. To summarize then, investment is necessary across the full spectrum of the industry. We know that making those investments will be affected by a number of factors about which we will learn much more today. But let me conclude by noting two recent factors: the passage of the U.S. Energy Policy Act of 2005 and the recent change in government in Canada, both of which seem to signal that the time is right to begin a more intensive discussion about the common opportunity we share. The time is right, I think, to work even more closely to ensure that appropriate investment occurs in all areas of the industry and on both sides of the border. I mentioned at the start the that the historic dynamic of northern supply to southern markets is changing. Year over year, we have witnessed a significant shift in the traditional flow of power north to south, with a significant growth of flows south to north. In my view, this is a positive sign and indicative of a successfully functioning integrated market. But to make this success an ongoing one, new investment is required. And today's discussions will no doubt shed light on just how we can bring some of that new investment about. On behalf of our members, I thank you for the opportunity to participate, and I look forward to our discussions. And with that, you can stop listening to me, and I will introduce briefly our presenters. And our first presenter, speaking to the topic of policy making and regulatory development, we have Kevin Kolevar, Director of the Office of Electricity Delivery and Energy Reliability with the U.S. Department of Energy. After Kevin, we'll ask Rick Jennings to give the Canadian view. Rick is the Assistant Deputy Minister, Energy Supply and Conservation with the Ministry of Energy in the Province of Ontario. We will then turn to two industry speakers. First, Joe Welch, President and CEO of International Transmission Company, and followed by Linda Chambers, Executive Vice President, Generation Technology and Supply Chain Management with TransAlta Corporation in Alberta. John Thorndike, Vice Chairman of Investment Banking at Merrill Lynch, will then provide us with his views from the perspective of the investment community. And finally, Richard Sergel, President and CEO of North American Electric Reliability Council, will give us the views, his views from an interested market observer's perspective, given his responsibility for ensuring the reliability of our interconnected North American grid. Now, as I mentioned earlier, all of the speakers have been asked to constrain their remarks to 10 minutes. I think that's probably the hardest speaking assignment that anyone ever gets. So I wish them well, and I will begin waving my arms and holding up 3-minute and 1-minute warnings as they get close to their deadlines. And so if I would ask Kevin if he could kick off the conversation.
Thanks, Hans. I think the easiest way to keep it to 10 is I could just conclude my remarks right now and take questions. But I will keep it brief. I think most people know the Secretary is speaking later today. I'll let him speak to most of the substance. You learn pretty quickly in this town the wisdom of not preempting your boss on these kinds of issues. I think most of you know the Office of Electricity Delivery and Energy Reliability is a relatively new construct at the Department of Energy. Within that office, we have a small permitting, siting, and analysis function that is tasked. It does a lot of state outreach, market analysis, and the like in the past. It's doing a lot of study work as mandated by the passage of EPAC 2005. It will be best known going forward for its role in executing the provisions of law relative to corridors and rights-of-way across federal lands. So I was asked to give our thoughts with respect to policy and regulation. I'll actually stick to policy. Our office, DOE in general, or largely in our office specifically, is not a regulatory body. We leave that to the FERC, and I know Mark Robertson is here, so that really motivates me not to speak to this even more. He'll be paying close attention. So I'll talk about the policy aspects of it. But generally speaking, when we are asked in our office the prospects of renewed and increasing investment in transmission, we are cautiously optimistic for a couple of reasons. One, we finally have the passage of federal legislation, and in our opinion, I say this not knowing if there are any Hill staff in the room that I'll upset, but having debated this legislation for the past 4 years, we thought had a profound impact on investment in and of itself. Now we have certainty in the law, and that goes into policies, it goes into whether there are fiscal incentives for construction of various types of generation and the like. We think that just having the passage of that act, almost not quite notwithstanding the provisions, but certainly having good provisions is a big factor. will go a long way towards helping to improve the investment climate. The second piece that I think is important, excuse me, is the inclusion of PUCA repeal in that legislation. We think that that'll have a positive impact on the investment climate and free some of the what are now unnecessary constraints in the market. And the third, and this is a reason I continue to be cautiously optimistic, is we now have a mechanism in place whereby irresponsible or unnecessary challenges of an obstructionist nature can, in the kind of final instance, be overcome. Of course, it's incumbent upon the federal government to get this right and not get it wrong, and sometimes that can be a heavy lift. But what I'm speaking to specifically is the requirement put on the Department of Energy to undertake a congestion study nationally, which we are underway with now. Complete that study by August 8th, which we will do. And then based on that study, to begin designation of corridors across the United States, whereby should a corridor be designated and a project be proposed within that corridor, and a state or states not act in a specific time frame, the door will be open to the FERC upon approval of that project, being able to grant an eminent domain authority, as is the case with the authorities that they have on natural gas lines. We think that that'll make a big difference. I will tell you that our approach going forward is one of caution and partnership. Obviously, I'm next to Rick here with the NERC, and we expect to be working closely with the NERC on this as well. We respect the state siting processes and the RTO processes and the like that are currently in place. We intend to build on them. And as we go forward with consideration of corridor designations, we hope that we may see a very limited use of the ultimate eminent domain authority being exercised, simply because its very existence proves to be a motivating factor in encouraging states and regions to undertake action on their own to make the appropriate and proper siting authorities available, and to move out within their geographic areas to expand transmission, and not have to rely on the federal government to come in and push through closed doors in every instance. The process as it stands now, we are in a comment period that ends the 6th, so in just a few days. The comment period came out of a notice of inquiry that we released about 4 weeks ago. Updated people on the status of the congestion study, invited comment on the criteria that the department intends to use with respect to corridor designation, and invited individuals, companies, and the like to come forward and if they were interested, make a case for an expedited corridor consideration. We expect that that would be a very high bar that would have to be passed in order to convince the department that it was in our best interest, the country's best interest, to pursue an expedited corridor designation before we've even concluded the congestion study. But we recognize that there may in fact be some areas where the congestion is so severe that that kind of attention is merited, and so we opened the door to that. We look forward to reviewing the comments that are coming in. We anticipate a strong working relationship, and I say we anticipate it, not hope for it, because we anticipate a strong working relationship with the FERC, with the RTOs, with the states, and with our Canadian partners. We believe that the best way to do this is in a cooperative fashion, make sure that all interested parties have a seat at the table early, that concerns are heard and considered and discussed in an open forum, so that there are no process fouls at the beginning of this. We understand that we've got to get this right, not just the first time, but every time, and that the best way to ensure that this process is carried out effectively for the next, it was about 13 years since the passage of the last EPAC, so I use that as a measurement. But at least for the next 13 years, is that all the stakeholders understand that everybody is bringing their best to the table and deliberating these considerations in a open, objective, and fair manner. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Rick, you would go next.
Yeah. I have some slides here. I'm not sure how do we run it from here? No? Oh, you got slides too? Okay. No, okay. That's okay. I don't know. Is it? Yes, I can start speaking to some of them. The main, I guess, point to make in terms of Canada, most of the jurisdiction, the responsibility for energy is at the provincial level. So there is some difference between that and the U.S. in that basically all the interprovincial generation, intra-provincial markets operation is all under provincial jurisdiction. There is a role for the federal government in terms of international trade, and in fact there's even a fairly limited one in terms of trade between provinces, but so it's principally a provincial jurisdiction. In terms of one of the areas coming out of the U.S. Energy Policy Act is the requirement to establish an electricity reliability organization and mandatory reliability standards. And Ontario has been very active in participating in that process. Ontario has already had since 1998 provision for mandatory standards in their legislation. So anything that yeah. Yeah. So in terms of, we're fairly well placed for the establishment of the ERO, and we have been working actively in a bilateral group involving ourselves, the federal government, and the U.S. Department of Energy and FERC in terms of ensuring that Canadian interests are reflected in how that is established. Other areas where the federal government has an involvement, where we have been involved, there's an issue in Canada about an east-west transmission grid, and the reason for that is that while Canadian entities are generally tend to be fairly well integrated with the U.S. and with the U.S. entities, so Ontario has fairly good ties with New York and Michigan as an example. There's much less interconnection between neighboring provinces, and that's really because of economics. There's always been more of an advantage to move power south and north to some extent, and less from east to west, and the distances as well. There's always an ongoing issue of reform in terms of approvals processes, and that's going on. Some of this information was already in this Canadian Electric Association material that's been put out. This just shows the varying in terms of exports and imports, and so Canada's trade, very large net exporter in the past, that has narrowed a bit. I see in the 2005 data our exports are a bit up compared to the imports. Ontario is a situation where we were very strongly a net exporter of electricity until we see the change about 1998. In early 1998, some of the nuclear capacity in Ontario was shut down, 8 units. And since then, for the most part, we've been about even or net importers. The 2004 shows we were slight net exporters. If you looked at this year, 2005, we were significant net importers. This is a too busy a slide, and I think it's also replicated in the Canadian Electricity Association material. But it just shows there's a wide variation across Canada as to what provinces have got into competitive markets and open access. So Ontario and Alberta, generally seen as having gone farther, although some people may say Ontario has pulled back farther. but the Alberta one has certainly consistently moved to a competitive market. Many of the other provinces have put in wholesale open access and transmission tariffs, and that's largely to comply with, to ensure that they can comply with FERC in terms of being able to have licenses in the States. This is in Ontario, and we are, I think, a unique structure. We've set up, we went to a fully competitive market, and we pulled back to what's called a hybrid market. Now, I won't go into the details of this, but one of the differences, we established an agency that's specifically responsible for ensuring adequacy of supply. So while we have a market structure, there's an entity that is, this is the Ontario Power Authority, which is down the bottom there. It is required to prepare an integrated system plan that includes transmission and generation, and it is able to contract for new supply demand management, and it has in it a conservation bureau that is tasked with driving through conservation initiatives. The plan that it develops has to be reviewed and approved by the Ontario Energy Board through a public process. And the other constraint on that plan is that the Minister of Energy retains responsibility for directing on the mix of generation supply mix, and can also give directives in a general sense in that area. So in terms of hybrid, the market is supposed to develop. Some generators receive the competitive price, some of the existing Ontario power generation, which continues to be owned by the Ontario government, is regulated. The nuclear and baseload hydro, some of it has price limits. The competitive market, most of the generators or anyone building new generation have insisted on long-term 20-year contracts. So the sort of how that will ultimately evolve, whether the competitive part will be able to grow or not, is obviously an issue. What we have done in terms of the small customers, which is about 50% of the load, about 98% of the customers, they are able to get a regulated price plan that's set annually by the Ontario Energy Board, but it is trued up. And so that has just happened. This is really the first year that's in place. There has been a large variance account built up in a single year, because we're talking about very large volumes. So the sustainability of that, I guess, will have to be looked at as well. And then the larger customers just buy or basically receive market prices. There are adjustments to make so that the effect of the regulated prices flows through to customers. This just shows the mix of capacity of import. Of course, Ontario has a plan to replace, or the government has committed to a target to replace coal-fired generation, which remains a significant share of capacity. And the commitment is to replace that by 2009. This just shows what's our experience. Ontario opened our market to competition May 2002. You can see from the timing of that, that probably wasn't good timing, because that was a very hot summer and a very cold winter. And so the market stayed open from May, or at least for small customers, stayed open from May till November, and then they were put on a fixed price. You can see that very much weather dependent. We have a situation where we have a major peak both in the summer and in the winter. So they were unfortunate from a maintenance perspective. That's a challenge. We had then a couple of years where the weather wasn't too bad, and we weren't in a very bad situation. If you look at last year, we had even higher prices because we had a very hot summer. We've had a very mild winter, so that the price so far year to date, in fact, February was under $50 Canadian. This just shows that the challenge for Ontario going forward. We have put in major new procurement initiatives in terms of RFPs for mostly gas-fired generation, various procurement requirements where the transmission system is congested. Most controversially will be to build a new power plant in downtown Toronto, which you can imagine has drawn some opposition. We have a commitment to refurbish new nuclear plants. That's part of that. But you can see going forward, we will have to make significant decisions on new supply. The principal driving thing, there's the coal replacement, and then there's also the nuclear mix that we have. There will have to be decisions on refurbishment or replacement of that starting as early as 2012. This just gives an example of some of the institutions. In addition to new supply, we have instituted refurbishment of about 2,000 megawatts. This just says we talked about intertie. As noted, Ontario has much more significant interties with the Michigan and New York. Those total currently now about 4,000 megawatts in terms of what's practical usable. There are ongoing talks to increase interconnections with Quebec on a more substantial basis, 1,250 megawatts. Manitoba, we have negotiations with them on developing major new supply up there. 1,500, potentially even more megawatts of transmission would have to be built. The challenge there is it would be built across that vast part of northern Ontario, which is basically largely uninhabited and doesn't really have roads and some of the other access. So that would be a very challenging project. This is just the Ontario Power Authority. One of its requirements is to develop an integrated power system plan. They've provided a report on what the future supply mix could be going forward. You can see that currently, if you look at just the production side, just over 50% of Ontario production comes from nuclear. Their recommendation is that continue over time. That even though that is the same mix, that would require some combination of major refurbishments, and each unit probably costs about $1 billion. That's the experience to date, and new supply. There is an expectation of major increase in renewables that would include hydro, but a lot of that, in terms of capacity terms, is wind. And then gas-fired, which we would be adding significant capacity, but in terms of its operation, it would be fairly small. And of course, the impact of what's happened with gas prices in the last few years has reflected some of the interest in how much gas you'd want to put into the mix. So just briefly then going forward, they have prepared the supply mix report. The minister is able to issue directives which would set out what the government wants the supply mix to be going forward, and the OPA, Ontario Power Authority, is supposed to take that into account and how it sets its planning up. So those directives could be issued as early as early April, and then the Power Authority would be developing or completing an integrated power system plan, which would include generation, demand management, transmission, and then that would be reviewed by the Ontario Energy Board beginning in the summer of 2006. There will be many contentious things there. Should they do more conservation, more renewables? I think a principal focus will be on nuclear. There will be certainly some specific transmission requirements that will also be very controversial. So the next steps after that, once that is approved, any of the individual projects would go under individual EAs. So just, I guess, in summary, in terms of the challenge, there's growth in the supply gap, and I mentioned the coal replacement plan and the aging of the nuclear plants in terms of the urgency of that. There's a lot of urgency in terms of actual requirements in an area where there's a lot of load growth but no generation, such as downtown Toronto, western Greater Toronto area, the north, and the needs of remote communities. And what has been a challenge to date in any of the plans going forward has been public opposition to infrastructure projects. Some of that, what people would call NIMBY, some of that is general environmental opposition to certain technologies, and some of it is driven by other interests, but that has certainly been a significant factor. Okay, thanks.
Rick, thank you very much. Can I ask Joe if you could lead off the industry perspective?
I don't know if I dare touch any of these.
Sorry.
While we're trying to get a couple slides up, I can keep mine to 10 minutes because I just brought conclusions, and hopefully we'll do something. Let me introduce myself. I'm President and CEO of International Transmission Company. We are the only, that doesn't work either. Does it work now? Okay. We're the only totally independent electric transmission company in the United States. That means we have no affiliation with any market participant. So we just run the high voltage electric transmission grid in southeast Michigan. Yesterday was our 3-year anniversary for being in business. And I think over the last 3 years we've done quite a bit. Just to kind of put a different exclamation point on it, over that 3-year period, we have invested in excess of $230 million in transmission upgrades and improvements, primarily in southeast Michigan. And we have worked real hard to further the advancement of both independent transmission companies and the prospect of transmission and the need for infrastructure development in North America. This is a picture that I like to bring along with me from time to time because this happened at about the 5th month of being in business. I was sitting in my office and I noticed that the lights blinked and then they blinked again. And I was talking to a gentleman that worked here in Washington. I said, I better go find out what happened. And our offices at that time were in the Ann Arbor Control Center. And just as I opened the door, a young lady that worked with me came up, and her eyes were about as big as saucers. And she said, all of the generation in Michigan has just gone offline. So, honest to God truth, went down to the control room. I was there within about a minute after it happened, and the people there were just stunned. Of course, we were all stunned too, and of course, we know the result of that. There was a lot of investigation into it. We were part of that investigation, but let it be said this, that the one thing that blackout showed, and it showed conclusively, that the grid in North America is fragile. It can be taken down easily, and never lose sight of that. And the fact is that the system has been ridden on for years and has suffered from underinvestment. And so that was the before, that's the after, and it's just real dark. So since that time, people have looked at what do we need to do to get infrastructure development in the United States. And I thought that this would be a simple task. And I guess I suffer from growing up in a small town, and I suffer from being an engineer. Because when you come from a small town, you usually just tell it like it is. And when you're an engineer, you say, well, that's the calculation, that's the answer. We didn't get graded on degrees of correctness. There was only one answer. If I got it right, I got it right. If I got it wrong, it was wrong. So what's preventing the progress? Because I thought we'd be a lot further down the road than we are today in this country. So I just thought I'd come up with 10 comments, and I have a briefcase behind me that I think I can substantiate most of them with, but I'll just toss these out here and then leave it for the group to discuss at a later form. You can go form your questions. Number one, vocational marginal price differentials are not consistent and do not effectively identify system constraints. We put in this great market system, and everyone said it was going to help us identify constraints. It doesn't do it, and if you think it does, the oldest LMP system right now operating in the United States is in PJM, and they haven't built very much transmission. So if you think it's working, there's empirical data there that says not so. LMP and financial transmissions rights create mixed market signals that impede transmission improvements. This is a tough one to do, but I've got an example in my briefcase. It doesn't work. Support for frozen rates is a misleading ruse appearing to protect customers but encourages little or no investment improvements and costing customers more. People freeze rates, and I can do the math. I've got an example in my briefcase. Tell you, there's only one thing frozen rates encourages. It encourages you not to invest in the grid. Regulatory jurisdictional battles between individual states and federal regulators results in the need for several approvals that leads to a long and drawn-out process. I can thank the day that we formed International Transmission Company because we were only federally regulated. And I never thought I'd be glad to be federally regulated, but when you consider the fact that you have multiple jurisdictions, it's very tough to get anything done. It just complicates it and complicates it immensely. The effects of FERC's incentives to invest are minimal under the vertically integrated electric utility business model. I think that the people in Washington have had the right idea to try to get incentives built, to get transmission and infrastructure built, but when you have split jurisdictions, it doesn't provide the kinds of incentives that it's going to get anything done. There's no regional pricing mechanism exists that will promote development of larger or regional projects. When you're trying to build a project that goes multi-state, it's unbelievable. And the pricing models that are out there today, even for someone like International Transmission, who's willing to make investments and expand the transmission grid on a regional basis. The only model that I have is that if I put an investment in the ground today, I have to charge the customers in southeast Michigan. Plain, pure, and simple. It's real hard to invest in a piece of transmission that is needed to serve load in Canada, that's needed to serve load in the PJM region, needed to serve load in New York. Because the Michigan customers pay for it, they're saying, why should I pay for it? We came up with a neat system, and I've heard it used, in multiple RTOs, cost causers pay. And if we keep cost causers paying, then we're going to find out that nothing gets done. It was seductively proposed. Citing authority for transmission projects still rests at the state and local level. The grid, I need to go back to the blackout. The grid is regional. It's international. And the citing of this to be left up to states and every local jurisdiction along the way is just unbelievable. It's unbelievable maze to get through. And if you don't believe it, I mean, we can build rocket ships faster than we can build 10 miles of transmission line. And yet there's nothing simpler than a steel structure sitting up there with a piece of wire on it. Regional transmission planning is not currently happening. The reality is that the individual transmission owners are developing projects within their own footprint that are then submitted to a regional plan. There is no coordinated regional plan. And we're all pretending that there is. If there is one, bring it to me and show it to me, because I've missed it. Vertically integrated utility models results in minimal investment because bulk of the dollars are directed towards the generation. I came from a company, we were 4% of the pie. And let me tell you something, that's not the place to be. And vertical integrated utility model is a detriment or deterrent to transmission investment because it may result in potential decrease in the value of the generation portfolio. We built one project in southeast Michigan. It was an $8 million project. It reduced fuel costs in southeast Michigan $63 million annually. Now, I'd like to be the guy that said I discovered that project and brought it to the table, but actually it's been there since 1988 and didn't get built because somebody's generation was going to be unloaded to the tune of $63 million annually. So, with that, those are my 10 reasons why I don't think infrastructure is being built, and I think I held my 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. Lots of voting points. Can I ask Linda Chambers to provide the Canadian perspective?
Yes.
Or a Canadian perspective?
Good morning. I'm from TransAlta. For those of you who are not familiar, we're an Alberta-based company. We have operations in Australia, Mexico, the United States, and Canada. And the view we would share, I think, is that we have many common issues, not only across border, but within the industry itself. And we think that a good job is being done now of diagnosing these issues. We can probably all agree on some common themes that, thank you. Can you hear me all right now? That Hans has outlined earlier. Reliable supply is important, transmission. Also, as Joseph talked about, permitting. We need to have clear, expedited permitting programs. Volatility on gas prices and how that impacts the consumer. But in the generator world, another one is the aging infrastructure of our electricity system throughout North America. As many of you would know, most of that infrastructure originated in the 1960s and 1970s. Certainly we think those issues now are being discussed, and the 2003 blackouts helped raise the profile on that. We do think there's a greater need for the public to understand more, similar to the comments Joseph made. Unless you understand the cost structures of our industry and the issues behind it, it's very hard to get mobilization on policy and public support for policy. So we do think that is an opportunity. I think, though, now that we've got a good diagnosis of the issues in the industry, we have to ensure that we keep moving them to action. One of the things that we observe is after the exuberant growth of the late 1990s and early 2000s, reserve margins in generation went up in some regions up into the 30% levels. We now see those levels coming back down in certain markets, 20, 15%, more traditional levels. And this is a real indicator for us as generators. We're long cycle, capital intensive businesses, and when we see reserve margins coming down, generally that's a signal for us that growth needs to begin before supply is outstripped by demand. However, that rational growth really won't occur until there continues to be more certainty on areas of rules and regulations. And I wanted to comment on Kevin's comments earlier on the U.S. Energy Act. We do think those are very good early start actions that begin to address some of the issues for generators to invest. Absolutely the examples he mentioned around PUCA repeal and some of the clean coal incentives and so forth are seen very positively by generators. But we don't think we're there yet. We think we still need to see very clear policy and regulatory direction on environment rules. Even though we are not in the transmission business, it absolutely affects generators, and we want to see the transmission constraints dealt with. And then, as I mentioned earlier, and I think also Joseph shares, the issue of permitting and actually getting a site developed. You know, many of you would be aware in the nuclear world, it's a good decade. Coal plants a good 5 years, and gas plants 3 years roughly. And if you think about where demand and supply are going, by the time we actually bring these more power to market, we need to be acting now on some of these issues. For us, another direct link, and for many others as well, of course, is that we're dependent on the capital markets to fund us in order to build these large capital-intensive power plants. And capital markets are looking for reasonable rates of return, and they're looking for stability. Volatility does not actually help us when we look for funding to support growth. I think there's another issue that generators can see that maybe some others don't, and that we don't hear a lot of dialogue on yet, which is the issue of the major suppliers to us. All of the OEMs, the Hitachis, GEs, Siemens, Alstoms of the world, have to be the companies that develop the technologies for clean coal and new technologies. Generators themselves are unlikely to be able to do this. We don't have the scale for the R&D that's required. And I think that we need to bring those OEMs more into this dialogue and encourage them to really focus on developing research. While some of these pilots are out there now, they're still cost prohibitive in many ways, and in other ways they're not even still effectively addressing some of the environmental concerns that have been raised, and mercury would be an example of that. The other thing we see from OEMs is that they tend to now move to some other markets. We've all heard about the heat in China, of activity there, and even in other markets, India, Europe are strong. And what's happening with some of the OEMs is that they're tending to say, let's let North America sort themselves out and then we'll come back into the market, other than some of the opportunities they're pursuing with things like scrubbers and somewhat some of the upgrades to the infrastructure on the coal side. So I do think we need to also look at engaging the OEMs in a deeper conversation. As a strategy for a generator to deal with this uncertainty, there's different things that we do. We diversify across several markets to spread our risk, and we also diversify across several fuel types. And the other thing that we would do, of course, is engage with partners to, in our case at TransAlta, we have Canadian partners that we've built infrastructure coal plant with, and that's been very successful. In the U.S., we have a very strong partnership on renewables with geothermal, and that's been very successful. And we think that that's an important aspect of this because we can work together to understand the risks and opportunities in each other's markets and look for ways to protect ourselves against volatility and uncertainty. So having said that, as I mentioned, it is a bit of a defensive strategy against uncertainty. Our strong preference would be to see continued movement forward. Somewhere between government and industry, we have to look for the methodologies that draw out action. I think dialogue is good, but we're very pleased when we see dialogue move into actual decisions and policy. That can happen bottom up through local and regional markets in areas like permitting, and certainly top down at the federal policy level when it comes to bigger concerns like the environment. And I do believe that the more collaborative we are across border, the more likely we are to stimulate these outcomes and actions sooner rather than later. We're optimistic on what we see. We think the good dialogues are happening, but now we really need to bring that home. And the worst fear that we have as a generator is that some of the issues where we feel very serious constraints, that those issues may overtake us. If we continue to have concerns about future blackouts or being unable to provide a reliable supply to the market, then the kinds of legislation and action that you get out of that tends to be overreaction and sometimes overcorrection. We would prefer that it not come to that. So while we're also cautiously optimistic, we do want to keep seeing things moving forward in these areas, and we think it's discussions like these that help to ensure that happens. And I think that's all I would say this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. John, would you give us the view from Wall Street?
Thank you, Hans. David Biette used a couple of phrases that jumped out at me. Pragmatic solutions was one of his phrases, and regular communication was the other. And Hans, you used the phrase turning point. I did my first utility deal over 30 years ago, and I remember back in those days we sat around a huge table and spent 3 days drafting the prospectus. And I'm sure the phrase turning point went into that prospectus in at least one spot. And I would say that in the intervening 33 years, we have in one way or another been at a turning point in the development of the electric market, and probably always will be. I'd like to make a few observations and then touch on 5 quick points. The bottom line is that I'm an optimist. I think the outlook is good. I think history is important. We want to take a little bit of a backward glance. But bottom line, investors will invest if they feel that they can get a proper return on their capital. And I believe that Wall Street, in very important ways, not just the investment banks, but the hedge funds and other pools of money, have stepped in to provide a bridge between the people who want to build power and who ought to build power and those who finance it. But let's tick off 5 points. Under traditional regulation, which was what was obtaining in the U.S. for years and years, sufficient new infrastructure investment was, in theory, assured, because you'd sit down and do integrated resource management, and you'd work things out, and theoretically, didn't always work out precisely in practice, but theoretically, you'd get the investment. But increasingly in our country, traditional regulation can be thought of as producing unacceptably high costs from both a consumer and a corporate perspective, threatening both household pocketbooks and jobs. And I have spoken to more than one utility CEO about a big corporate or industrial company coming to him and saying, if you don't get my rates down, I can be in state X or state Y next week and pay half the power prices that I pay to you. And so, since this dialogue mostly took place in the coastal states, California, Massachusetts, New York, they were the ones who led in the deregulation movements, and what we had at the turn of the century was basically a trifurcated system, where we had states like the coastal states who were deregulated. We had, on the other hand, the Southeast and the Northwest who did not share this reformist view. They took an if it ain't broke, don't fix it approach. By the way, they also had the lowest cost power. And a third group of states, Ohio comes to mind, took a middle ground. They sort of deregulated and sort of didn't. So we were faced with a situation where the question was, how do we, that is we equaling people who are concerned about the adequacy of the electric system, how do we create the right incentives so that the needed power will be built in those areas which are significantly out of supply and demand balance. Now, it's a much simpler process in the United States today if you're under a traditional vertically integrated mode, and I take the case of our client, Great Plains Energy, which is engaged in building a large coal plant. They simply got all the stakeholders around a table, literally literally around the table, the PUC, the regulators, the rating agencies, the interveners, and they worked out a set of conditions under which a large coal plant could be built, and everybody understands what the conditions are now. It's not set in stone, and things could go wrong, and my experience is that plenty of things will go wrong, but I believe that that plant will get built. But the real concern, and from the Canadian perspective, as you nervously look down at the U.S. and you see this trifurcated system, and you see a series of disincentives, frankly, and I'm very indebted to an article that appeared in I think it was Electricity Perspectives about a year ago, in which these disincentives, which I'll quickly touch on, were very brilliantly set out. I thought, generally speaking, when investment decision making is no longer relatively centralized in a lot of states, where decisions are consolidated in large entities, but on the contrary, they're decentralized, with decisions that are made independently by large and small entities throughout the chain, and this creates a lot of volatility and risk. And the question is, how can we get sponsors of projects to take the leap when we have a number of disincentives? We have the rating agency disincentive. Everybody knows what's happened with the rating agencies, and it isn't just a question of Company X getting downgraded. When Company X gets downgraded, a lot of brilliant plans go up in smoke because it affects other people who deal with Company X. Rate of return disincentives, there's the constant pulling and pushing with regulators to get the right kind of return. There's that Joseph mentioned, I think, the free rider disincentive. Obviously, when somebody improves a high voltage transmission line or builds a new one, plenty of people in the chain benefit from that, and they get it for free, so to speak. That's called the free rider disincentive. There's a contingency disincentive to build equipment which would provide some insurance policy in case of a massive blackout. Well, who's going to build that in a deregulated environment when there aren't any methods for reviewing and cost sharing those expenses? And finally, there's been a price signal disincentive. The growth of the wholesale electric market has, over the last 6 or 7 years, been a kind of a disappointment. In fact, it's been a big disappointment. Now, I think it's been getting better. In fact, I think that's the real theme of my talk. I think the Wall Street has finally figured out how to make a contribution, and what we've got now is a situation where the financial community, and I'll talk about investment banks because that's what I am, but with our challenge to bridge the gap between those who would build the needed infrastructure and those who have traditionally financed it. Basically, let's look quickly at what we have, who the players are in the equation. First of all, the regulated utilities offer what they have always offered, which is operating expertise, competently applied, in return for predictable returns at or above their cost of capital. Secondly, we have the project sponsors, the IPPs, the Transaltas and others. These sponsors offer creativity, they offer vision, daring, and risk capital, but they demand returns which are substantially above the cost of capital of utilities. Thirdly, we have traditional utility investors, different kinds of financial institutions as well as individuals. And these people, and there's plenty of money, people who want to make investments in companies and projects that have clearly defined risks and protections. But we've had all of these disincentives to long-term projects. And now my firm and others have been able to step in. We have, along with several others, an international presence in the commodities business, including fuels and power. Merrill Lynch did last year. We bought Wayne Leonard's business. We got back into the business. We'd been in it, and we got out of it, and now we're back into it, and we're basically international because you can't be in the commodities business and not be international. We have to know what the snow melt is in Spain in order to trade in Texas, and we do. But basically, we have reached the position now, and so have several of our competitors, where if a project makes sense, that is, it's up to snuff from a fuel, a geography, a heat rate, a political, regulatory, commercial point of view, we can produce a one-stop shopping proposal which will arrange and fully underwrite all the capital needed for getting a project built. And that is for the construction financing, the term loan financing, working capital, letter of credit, and we can get it permanently financed with medium to long-term maturities, very great tax-exempt opportunities. And basically, what we've been able to do is remove the commodity risk from a project sufficiently such that traditional lenders perceive a risk-reward ratio that allows them to charge interest rates low enough to accommodate sponsors' returns, which, as I said, are much higher. And we've been able to show up at the table with multi-year forward and multi-year fixed price fuel contracts and even power purchase contracts. And I think it's been a slow start. We're coming up to speed. And as I say, I'm an optimist that that what's needed, what is going to be needed, will be built. But I also think that we will always be at "quote unquote" a turning point whenever we are. Thank you.
Now, in the U.S., the Energy Policy Act of 2005 directed the FERC here to name an electric reliability organization for the purpose of establishing, for the first time, mandatory electricity standards that would be enforceable. And pursuant to that law, the FERC on February the 2nd issued a final rule. And the final rule is a giant step forward toward reliability improvement, both for what it did and what it did not do. Right? It's a major step forward because the Commission articulated a clear and compelling and international vision of what it expects of an electric ERO. They want a strong ERO, setting and enforcing continental electricity reliability standards aggressively. But the order is also on target because it did not direct the ERO to do that in any particular way. It left the path that it must take to the ERO to propose. And that's particularly important because this indeed needs to be an international organization, and it will require significant flexibility for us to do that effectively. Applications are due by April the 4th, and NERC, a voluntary industry standards organization, we've been at it for 30 years, and I now have the privilege to lead it, will apply. And we will simultaneously file with the appropriate Canadian provinces and the agencies, organizations there as required. And we intend to do that simultaneously. This should come as no surprise to those following us, as we have put out 2 drafts of our application to make sure that it has the support of the stakeholders in the industry. And along with our application, we'll also file the current standards, which are called version 0. And our vision has been and remains to be named the ERO for all of North America on the 1st anniversary of the law, which would be August of this year. And we hope the Commission, plus or minus a month, will be able to do that. We don't expect to get it all right in our application. I'm fully expecting a compliance filing that we'll have to make that will probably relate to the standards as well. But But that's probably a good thing if we have to make a compliance filing. It will allow us the time to make sure that we have all of the standards exactly right and they meet everyone's expectations. It will allow us to complete activities in Canada on a parallel path, and that is very important. It will facilitate our being able to complete regional delegation agreements that can be signed and ready to implement when we start business, hopefully on the 1st of next year. Certainly a tremendous amount of work to be done, and I believe we will get it done. But I'm here to tell you it is not enough. Because all of that won't in and of itself improve reliability. To improve reliability, we must raise the bar. We must set our expectations higher. And if we're going to raise the bar, we must know where it is today. And we don't. Right? Now there are 4 important ways we must measure the grid and begin to improve what we know about it. The first is we must benchmark performance. We must have a top 10 list of things we're trying to accomplish. And we must have a dashboard that's visible to all of you that tells you how the industry is doing. Second, we must evaluate, determine the root cause, and communicate what we learn from every event on the system. And we can't wait for outages to do that, much less major outages. We must do that on near misses. Right? Third, our efforts in the area of resource adequacy must change. We must do more than arithmetic if we're going to provide value. We must identify risks and systematically evaluate them. And finally, we need a real-time information system that improves reliability. We've recently received a report from Congress, prepared by the Department of Energy and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, about a transmission monitoring system. The report was prepared pursuant to the Energy Policy Act, and we've reviewed the report and are enthusiastic about its content and recommendations. The investigations into and possible development of a transmission monitoring system would be enabled by several factors. The first is the recognition of the need for the system by industry and regulatory agencies. I think that's obvious. The second is the learning and recommendations from the 2003 blackout. As I've already alluded, that's the wrong way to be learning, but nevertheless, it is a way to learn. And finally, the previous work accomplished by the National Electric Infrastructure Security Monitoring System places the current effort in the fortunate position of not starting from scratch. So those are 4 ways which we can systematically improve the information that we have and the measurements of that system. So in conclusion, if we're to set tough standards and enforce them vigorously, we will have to take a step forward in what we know. But if we start to measure how we are doing, both past, real time, and future, we can impact the investment cycle by providing the strongest possible signal, that of one of a compelling and enduring need. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Well, we've set a record. We've finished half an hour early. I'm staggered. I don't quite know what to say, but I've been told what to say, so I will share it with you. And that is that we will break now, but we will only take 15 minutes, and we will come back and therefore have longer period for discussion, and secondly, for the transition to our lunch at the embassy. So with that, why don't we try to be back by 10 minutes to 10.